Hi, everyone. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to share with you a little bit about what we're going to be examining in our worship service on Sunday. So, as you know, we've been in the book of Exodus the past couple of weeks, and we have talked about and learned about how it's hard to leave the familiar and how complaining can be contagious, and also looking at covenant relationship and how God wants us to live. This next week, we are going to be in the book of Exodus again. In chapter 32, we're going to be looking at the first 14 verses. We're going to pay particular attention to the first 6 verses. And this is the Israelites' rejection of faith. We are also going to be looking at the consequences of that and the mercy that God has through Moses's intercession. But again, particularly paying attention to this rejection of faith. What was going on with the Israelites that they did this? And then how does this speak to us today? What are the things that are familiar, kind of going along with that theme, the things that are familiar to us and the ways that we might inadvertently stray from our relationship with Jesus? And so we're going to be looking at a couple of particular terms that will help us to dive into this text a little bit more. And there's 3 that I want to talk about here briefly with you. And this, we started off right at the very first verse where we see this term delay. So Moses, way back in chapter 24 of Exodus, Moses had been summoned up the Mount Sinai by God. And we learn in verse 24:18 that Moses is there for 40 days. This is symbolic of being a very long time. So we are picking up in verse 1 of Exodus 32 how the Israelites are very concerned about the delay. Moses is delayed. He's not coming back down. What's going on with this? So it's interesting that God summons Moses up in chapter 24. This is telling us that for chapters 25 to 31, that's all the conversation, the content of the conversation between God and Moses. So when we pick this up in chapter 32, the Israelites, they're done. This is too long for them to be without Moses. And there is the delay, the root word there, there's a connotation of being abandoned. They don't know what's happened to Moses. Did he perish when he went up the mountain? Was he taken up like Enoch? Enoch walked with God and then was no more. We see this in Genesis 5. So they're familiar with all of this and the woes of living in the desert. So maybe Moses is not coming back. And so they're wrought with fear and anxiety, and they need to do something. So this is what delay is telling us. So there's another term that we want to examine with this text, and that is the breakaway or to take off. So what happens in this text is the Israelites go to Aaron, he's second in command, say, make us gods. And this is because the Israelites need to have a God to worship. They need someone to protect them. They need someone to help them, to guide them, to give them provisions. We know from chapters 15, 16, and 17, the Israelites are very aware of how Moses, as Moses has interceded for them, they got access to water, they got access to food. And so now that Moses is gone, what are they to do? So they need to act very quickly. Aaron tells them, he complies with making of a god or gods, and he tells them, take off your golden earrings and bring them to him, and he's going to make a golden calf out of that. And they do, but the word here is, if you look at the root word, it means to snatch off or to break off. There's this sense of urgency. If you think of someone today wearing a large golden hoop earring and it gets caught on something and it rips away the skin, tears through the skin, that's what we're talking about here. It's this kind of urgency. We've got to get this jewelry off now. We've got to get this to Aaron right away. We have to have God's made because we are going to surely die without this. So they do. Aaron makes them a golden calf, and then he tells them, tomorrow We're going to have a festival to the Lord. And they do. They sit down to eat and drink, and then they rise up to revel. And this is our third term. They rise up to revel. There's a connotation of frivolity here. There's a connotation of sexual play here. There's this notion of worshiping to actually Yahweh, as it turns out. They're worshiping to Yahweh, but they're doing it in a different way. They're doing it in a way that breaks the second commandment, and it's not the way that they've been taught to worship. And this is the Israelites rejecting their faith in Yahweh. They desperately want to have the protection of God. They don't know how to do this without Moses, and so they're seeking basically a counterfeit way of going about this. So they move from truly worshiping Yahweh by engaging in a way of worship that's really deserting their duties. So in their anxiety and fear, they turn from the one true God to a counterfeit God. They break their covenant. So we're going to examine this and think about ways in our own lives of what do we need to be taking stock of and being careful to pay attention to so that we are truly worshiping our God. I look forward to exploring this further with you.